9 months after I sentenced Daniel Mercer, I was sent a photo of him kneeling in a basement hallway beneath a new red sprinkler pipe while a little girl in pink rain boots held a flashlight for him with both hands. Elena Ortiz stood a few feet behind that child, her back straight, her face still, watching the work and not leaving. That image is why I am still talking about this case. Let me go back to the beginning. Before I do, I want to ask you something. Have you ever stayed in the room with someone who hurt you because leaving would have been easier, but staying might have made one good thing possible? Subscribe. I mean that plainly. Subscribe because that choice sits at the center of this story, and I want you here when it comes into view. When Elena Ortiz first walked into my courtroom, she carried a thick manila folder against her chest with both arms, not like papers, but like something that still had weight long after paper should have been light. She was 34 years old, and grief had not bent her posture. What I noticed most was that she did not perform anger for the room. She sat down, lined up her folder with the edge of the table, and once, when Daniel Mercer's mother began to cry into a handkerchief 2 rows behind the defense table, Elena slid the box of tissues down the rail without looking back. That told me something about who she was choosing to be in a place she had every right to let go dark. The sorrow current of this case began at 2:13 a.m. on November 14, 2024, at Cedar Glen Apartments, 1187 Brookline Avenue in Dayton, Ohio. A fire started in the basement laundry room after lint near the rear dryer ignited against a failing motor. It should have met water almost at once. It did not. The main sprinkler control valve had been shut on August 24, 2024, and the water flow alarm had been disabled the same day. Luis Ortega, the maintenance worker, testified that Daniel Mercer stood beside the riser room door that afternoon and said, "Leave it off until next quarter. We need the numbers to breathe." Luis said it in a flat voice. He did not need to help it. Smoke climbed faster than most people think. It filled the west stairwell, then the third-floor hall. 26 residents got out. 1 did not. Mateo Ortiz, age 8, died from smoke inhalation in apartment 3B. His mother reached the landing and turned back for him because he had hidden under his bed when the alarm began. A firefighter brought her out on the second trip in. By then, the hall had gone black. The ceiling above Mateo's room stayed dry the whole time. That detail lived with me. When the case first crossed my desk, the file was thick enough that the clerk used 2 red bands to hold it shut. The top layer was made of ordinary things: inspection invoices, emails, budget notes, call logs, a photo of a valve handle turned crosswise against the pipe. Under that were the things that were not ordinary at all: fire scene photos, Mateo's death report, a stack of tenant loss lists with words like inhaler, wedding dress, insulin, ashes, cat. There is a document most people do not know about called a presentence investigation report. It comes after conviction and before sentencing, and it is not there to soften anything. It is there so I do not confuse a person's worst act with the whole of their life. The morning I read Elena's victim statement beside Daniel's written admission that he left the system off, I felt grief and hope at the same time, and I did not know where to set either one down. From the bench, entrances tell me things no file can. When Elena came in for the first day of trial, 3 residents in the gallery straightened in their seats before she even reached counsel table. She never turned to see them do it, but I could. She stopped only once near the front rail to tuck a loose sheet back into that folder. From where I sat, I could see the top page for 1 second. It was a photo of a child in a soccer jersey, smiling hard enough to make the picture feel louder than the room. She placed that photo face down before the lawyers began. If you are still with me, you have probably gone quiet. Whatever was around you when this started has probably fallen back a little. Subscribe. Attention like that deserves the rest of the story. Subscribe and stay with me. Daniel Mercer was 41 years old. He had managed Cedar Glen for 6 years. In court, he wore the same gray suit often enough that I began to notice the shine at both cuffs. The harm he caused was plain and serious, and nothing about seeing him clearly reduced that. Still, I also saw him do one small thing on the second day that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with who he was when no one thought it mattered. His father, who walked with a cane, sat down awkwardly and left one shoelace dragging. Daniel crouched, tied it, and pressed the lace flat against the old man's shoe before he stood back up. I had to see that and also not let it blur what his choices had done. That was part of my work. His entrance was different from Elena's. People watched him because they had to decide where to put their own feelings about him. Some looked away fast, some did not. The detail I could see from the bench was this. Each time he entered, his eyes lifted once to the sprinkler head above the courtroom door before he took his seat. Not long, not for show, just long enough that I knew he saw it every time. He kept both hands open on the table after that, palms down, as if closing them would have looked too much like hiding. The grace current did not begin with a speech. It began 6 minutes after the fire was called in. The first body camera clip from Fire Captain Mara Baines showed Daniel outside the building in a t-shirt and socks, covered in soot, trying to go back through the front doors after firefighters had already pushed him away twice. In the clip, someone off camera said, "Sir, stop." He said, "3B, Mateo is in 3B. He was the reason the water did not fall. And there he was on the curb saying the child's name so the medics would not lose it in the noise. Grace does not erase fault. It just arrives where you did not expect it and makes a clean story harder to tell. The first piece of evidence that made me stop for the sorrow current was Exhibit 12, a photo from Mateo's bedroom. The bedspread had cartoon planets on it. There was a nightlight melted halfway into the wall near the baseboard. Above the bed, the sprinkler head sat quiet and dry, a small metal mouth that had never opened. The state's fire expert pointed to it with a pen and explained that if the valve had been open, activation likely would have contained the fire in the laundry room for the first several minutes. Several minutes do not sound like much until they are the difference between a mother reaching a child and not reaching him. I put the photo down and waited before I spoke again. The first piece of evidence that opened the grace current was not from Daniel. It came from Elena. During her testimony, the prosecutor asked her what she wanted from the court. She held Mateo's inhaler cap in her left hand the whole time she answered. She said, "My son died in a room built for sleep, not for bargaining." That belonged to the sorrow current. Then, a little later, when asked what she wanted the sentence to do, she said, "If he is punished and still never has to be useful, then the fire keeps taking." That belonged to the grace current. When she finished, Daniel's mother covered her mouth with both hands, and Elena pushed the water pitcher toward the defense table with a careful, steady arm. As the trial moved on, the two currents ran side by side until one piece of testimony carried both at once. Luis Ortega returned to the stand, and the prosecutor asked him what Daniel was like as a manager before the fire. Luis said, "He saved pennies like they were people, and then on the worst night he tried to save people like pennies did not matter anymore." I wrote that down. It was not a polished line. It was tired and plain and true. It held the whole case in one sentence. You could hear the room breathe differently after he said it. Here is what I am offering. The rest of this story told the way I lived it from the bench, with nothing settled too early and nothing softened, because that would be easier. Subscribe if that is what you want. I will keep going. Daniel waived a jury. That meant the decision came to me. Some people think that makes a case cleaner. It does not. It only means there are fewer places to set the weight down. The defense argued that the ownership company had cut staffing, delayed repairs, and tied Daniel's pay to vacancy rates and expense control. All of that was supported by records. 3 weeks before the fire, he had sent an email asking for approval on a $12,860 sprinkler repair and a $310 monthly monitoring restart. Ownership said no. Then Daniel made the choice that brought him into my courtroom. He shut the system anyway and left it shut. The defense did not try to pretend the valve turned itself. I respected that. Daniel's lawyer, Priya Shah, said one sentence I did not expect. She said, "He did not come here asking to be called good. He came here asking to be made useful." That was not procedural talk. That was a human request shaped inside a legal one. Still, there were things her argument could not resolve. Mateo Ortiz was dead. 26 people ran from a building that should have defended them while they slept. A mother's grief does not get smaller because a man was also under pressure. The sorrow current contained facts that no argument could move. There is another word most people do not hear unless they end up in a courtroom like mine. It is allocution. It means the person about to be sentenced gets a few minutes to speak directly before I rule. No questions, no cross-examination, just their own words standing in the open. When Daniel took that chance, he did not help himself in the easy ways first. He said, "I knew the system was off, and I left it off." That was the sorrow current speaking through him. Later he said, "If there is work nobody wants, give it to me first." That was the grace current. Then he said the sentence I wrote down and looked at for a long time. He said, "I told myself I was saving their homes, but I would not have let my own son sleep under that ceiling." I wrote it down. I looked at it for a long time. Both things I was feeling were in that one sentence. I did not expect that. While he spoke, Elena did not look at him until the last line. When she did, it was not with softness, and it was not with hate alone. It was the face of someone hearing the truth too late and still choosing to hear it. From the bench I could see her thumb pressing against the plastic inhaler cap so hard that the edge marked her skin. I could also see her keep listening. People think listening is passive. Sometimes it is the hardest thing anyone does in a room. When I was 12, lightning hit my uncle's barn in Mason County just before dark. By sunrise, the roof was gone, one mare was gone, and the air still smelled like wet ash and hay. My uncle stood in the mud holding a coffee can full of bent nails because he had nowhere else to put his hands. Around 8 that morning, our neighbor Ruth Harper pulled up in a pickup full of fence posts, stepped out, and started unloading before anyone said a word. My uncle cried once and kept lifting wood. Ruth kept handing him the next post. I have never forgotten that morning. I just realized, saying that out loud, that I have never set that memory beside this case before today. Subscribe. That realization matters for what came next. Subscribe now. The point of convergence arrived during the sentencing hearing, but I saw it forming before that. The clerk handed me a stack of letters from residents at Cedar Glen. Some wanted prison and nothing else. Some wanted prison and repairs. One wanted no prison at all if Daniel spent years making buildings safe for people he would never meet. The strongest letter to me was from Mrs. Darlene Kim in Unit 2A, who had survived the fire and lost every photograph of her husband. She wrote, "He is the reason my ceiling did not help me, and he is also the one who stood outside in the cold until every name was checked." One sentence, both rivers. There was nowhere left to keep them separate after that. I want to stop here for just a moment, not for effect, because what I just said still sits with me, and I need a second with it. Subscribe while I take that second. Subscribe and stay. All right, let me keep going. By the day I was ready to rule, I had read the file until the paper edges felt familiar under my fingers. I had decided carefully. I had decided knowing that this ruling had to hold the weight of what was lost and also leave room for what might still happen. Those two things do not always fit in the same ruling. In this case, they did. I had made sure they did. Daniel sat with both hands flat on the table. Elena sat with Mateo's photo upright now, facing me. My own hands were resting on the bench, one over the other, because I did not trust them not to move if I left them free. I found Daniel Mercer guilty of involuntary manslaughter, unlawful impairment of a fire protection system, and 26 counts of reckless endangerment. The room stayed very still after I said it. Daniel closed his eyes once. Elena did not close hers at all. Then I began to sentence him, and I did it in the plainest language I had. I said, "Mr. Mercer, I am ordering you to serve 18 months in county custody, with work release beginning after the first 90 days if you follow every rule from the start. I am doing that because what you did cannot be answered by regret alone. You took safety away from sleeping people. There has to be a loss to you that is not symbolic. But I am also leaving room for labor because sitting still will not repair what your choice damaged." I said, "I'm ordering restitution in the amount of $286,400. Of that, $150,000 will go directly to Elena Ortiz for relocation, funeral expenses, counseling, and the daily costs that grief drags behind it. $9,600 will be divided among the displaced residents for uninsured losses. $40,000 will go into the Mateo Ortiz Memorial Fire Safety Fund to provide smoke alarms, child escape kits, and emergency lodging vouchers for low-income tenants in Montgomery County. Money does not restore a child. It can still carry a burden that should not remain on the shoulders of the people you harmed. I said, I am also ordering 200 hours of supervised restorative labor with Dayton Safe Homes Coalition. You will help inspect, document, and physically assist with sprinkler and alarm upgrades in low-income apartment buildings, senior housing, and shelter units. You will not choose the sites. You will not be praised for being there. You will go where you are sent, and you will learn what safety costs when it is measured in lives instead of invoices. I am ordering it because the best answer to a choice that made people less safe is years of work that make strangers safer. I said, there is more. I am ordering weekly counseling for the first 18 months focused on decision-making under pressure, shame, and avoidance. The evidence showed me that your failure was not ignorance. It was the habit of looking at danger, feeling fear, and then hiding it inside a number. That habit does not fix itself. I am ordering quarterly code and ethics training as well, not because a class can create a conscience, but because a conscience still needs structure if it is going to hold when money tightens. I said, and there is one more thing. Once each month for 2 years, you will attend a restorative accountability conference with any Cedar Glen residents who choose to participate. A trained facilitator will be present. No one will be required to forgive you. No one will be required to speak gently to you. You will listen, answer honestly, and hear what the paperwork did not hear. Accountability is not complete when it runs only upward to a judge. It must also run outward to the people who lived inside the result. Then I gave him the condition for early completion, the one part of the sentence that said something I could not say as praise. I said, if after 24 months you have completed at least 600 hours of restorative labor, made every restitution payment on time for 18 straight months, missed no counseling sessions without cause, and helped secure documented fire safety compliance for 12 residential buildings through your assigned work, this court will allow you to petition for early termination of supervision. I am putting that in this sentence because I believe actions repeated over time tell the truth better than promises do. If you want less time under this order, then build the record that earns it. After that, I looked at him and said what I needed to say outside the mechanics of the sentence. I said, you disabled the one system meant to act when people are asleep and seconds matter most. Elena Ortiz lost her son, and every resident of Cedar Glen lost the simple trust that a ceiling will help when fire begins. You are more than the worst choice you made, but you are not less than it either. Everyone in this room is being asked to hold pain and possibility in the same pair of hands today. Safety always seems cheap until somebody else pays for its absence. You just heard what I said to him in that courtroom. Hold that with me for a moment. Subscribe before we go further, because what happened after I said it is the part of this case I have thought about the most. Subscribe now. When the hearing ended and the room began to empty, I stayed seated for a minute, the way I often do when I need the bench to stop feeling like a platform and start feeling like wood again. Elena stood first. She picked up Mateo's photo, tucked it back into the manila folder, and instead of going straight to the aisle, she turned toward Daniel. A deputy was already beside him. She did not step close. She said, "Do the work. Do not make me carry both parts of this by myself." I heard it from where I sat. Daniel nodded once and put his hand over his mouth. Before I stood up, I laid both palms flat on the bench and stayed there until the room had thinned. On June 14, 2025, I received the first formal progress packet from Dayton Safe Homes Coalition. Tucked inside was the photo I opened this story with. Daniel was kneeling under a new sprinkler line in the basement of Willow Court Senior Housing, wrench in one hand, flashlight glare on the pipe. A little girl visiting her grandmother held the light for him in pink rain boots that were 2 sizes too big. Elena was there because the Mateo Ortiz Memorial Fire Safety Fund had paid for emergency escape kits in that building, and she had volunteered to hand them out that day. In the photo, no one looked healed. Everyone looked present. That mattered to me. Daniel appealed. The case went to the Ohio 2nd District Court of Appeals. On May 6, 2026, that court affirmed the conviction and the sentence in full. In plain terms, the appellate judges said I had the facts, the law, and the scope of the sentence right, and that the mix of custody, restitution, and restorative conditions fit the record. It took just under 11 months from notice of appeal to final decision. When I read the opinion, I did not feel triumph. I felt steadiness and sorrow together, the same pair I had been carrying from the start. This case showed me something I am still working out. There are moments in this work when the law is not only deciding what happened, it is deciding whether truth will be used to close a door or to build one. I have seen many people ask for mercy when what they really wanted was distance from consequences. I have seen others accept consequences so fully that mercy no longer looked like softness. This case made that difference plain to me in a way no other had. I have never said this in any other professional setting, but here it is. There are rulings I remember for being correct, and there are rulings I remember for being true. This was one of the second kind. If you are someone who recognized the sorrow current in this story, if you know what it is to look at the place where safety failed and understand in one instant that life has split into before and after, I want to say one careful thing to you. I saw that look in Elena Ortiz's face. I saw it on the day she testified, and I saw it again on the day of sentencing. What I also saw, and I want you to hear this clearly, is that the loss did not erase her ability to choose the shape of her own presence. She remained herself inside grief. The fire did not get to take that too. And if you are someone who recognizes yourself in Daniel Mercer, not in the exact facts maybe, but in the harder truth that you made a real choice, caused real harm, and now do not know what comes after, let me tell you what I have seen from that chair. The people who move towards something are almost never the people with the cleanest speeches. They are the ones who stop defending the part of the story that is already over and start showing up for the part that still has work in it. What separates them is not shame. Plenty of people feel shame. What matters is whether they will let shame turn into service. I wish I could say that to every person who ever stood where he stood. Months later, Elena sent a short letter through the clerk's office. It was 3 sentences long. The line that stayed with me said, "I still grieve Mateo every day, but the children in those buildings sleep under working sprinklers now." That belonged to the grace current, and it did not cancel the sorrow current at all. It stood beside it. I have been carrying that sentence with me too. So I come back to the image I opened with. Daniel Mercer on one knee in a basement hallway, wrench in one hand, a child in pink rain boots holding the flashlight steady. Elena Ortiz a few feet behind them, watching the work and not leaving. That is why I told you this story. If you want the others, subscribe. Leave a comment if you are one of the people willing to sit in a room where grief and grace are both allowed to stay.